A millionaire fired his nanny because the children were crying, and he believed the problem was solved. But what he found the next day was not an object. It was the trace of a pain that could never be bought. That small metal locket was silent proof that the Thorn house had expelled sacrifice, but not the memory of humiliation. David's system was about to collapse under the weight of a secret. What can break a man who believes he is unbreakable? Silence in Greenwich, Connecticut was expensive. It was not the absence of sound, but the absence of effort, a state purchased with David Thorn's fortune. His mansion, a monument of glass and stone, had been carefully sealed against any hint of emotional inconvenience. Life there was an exhibition of success, a stage where pain and disorder were forbidden. Marta, the nanny, was a ghost in this theater. She came from a reality where sacrifice was not a virtue, but a requirement for survival. She had traded the dignity of being seen for the urgency of a paycheck. Her job was not only to look after Olivia and Ethan, it was, above all, to silence them. She was the guardian of David's artificial peace, bearing the weight of exhaustion on her shoulders. Every minute devoted to someone else's children meant one less minute for her own forgotten dreams. That morning, the system failed. Tension announced itself in the creak of wood beneath David's polished shoes as he descended the spiral staircase. Olivia, 6 years old, was not crying from pain, but from childish frustration, an ordinary tantrum that Marta was trying patiently to soothe. To David, the sound was an offensive noise, an imperfection in the tapestry of his perfectly arranged morning of video calls. His eyes did not register Marta kneeling on the floor, her patience almost gone after an 18-hour shift, the effort visible in her red, burning eyes. He saw only a problem. His voice was calm, but carried the icy contempt of someone discarding an object. He made it clear that he paid for comfort, not for drama, and that she had failed in her mission to keep the house in absolute peace. The humiliation for Marta was not in the dismissal itself, but in the erasure. Months of sacrifice, the dedication that had cost her nights of sleep and the absence from her own home, were reduced to a single inconvenient moment of noise. Money, the only thing that mattered to David, was thrown in her direction in a rushed amount, simply to end the matter. Marta felt the universal wound of being invisible. She accepted the money, not out of submission, but from a dark understanding. In her world, dignity was a luxury, and money was the only real currency. Without a word, the nanny gathered her things, her exhaustion hardening into silent determination, and left the house, carrying the pain of that contempt with her. David did not even bother to watch her leave. He returned to his conference, satisfied that he had resolved the disturbance. But the disruptive event was not over. The next morning, the first thing David noticed was not the silence, but the absence of something. When he went to check on the children, he stumbled on a small object on the floor of Olivia's room. He picked it up between 2 fingers, as if it were a piece of trash that might contaminate his perfection. It was a small metal locket, worn down, with a blurred photograph of a child inside. It did not belong to Olivia. It belonged, undeniably, to the woman he had fired. And there was something else. A faint smell of lavender and a weight that felt strangely charged. David's first choice presented itself: ignore the object, reinforcing his bubble of comfort, or allow a rush of dopamine-fueled curiosity to pierce his armor. He stared at it. What was it about that small item that disturbed the order of his world so powerfully? And what was the silent secret of that invisible woman he had just expelled? What began as a simple dismissal became proof that true sacrifice is always invisible. David Thorn held the locket. It was the most worn out and least valuable object in his mansion and, paradoxically, the heaviest. A cheap piece of metal, its edge slightly bent from constant use, that disturbed the sterilized perfection of his marble and steel office. David was used to solving problems with a check. With Marta, he had created only a mystery that now clung to his hand like a strange guilt. The man who valued only appearances could not stop staring at the blurred image inside the locket. It was a child, small, with large dark eyes, staring outward, beyond time and space. David did not know him, but the look in that photograph carried the weight of an urgency he had never experienced. It was not the urgency of a meeting that would decide millions, but the urgency of fundamental need. The smell of lavender was the last trace of the nanny, a simple and pure fragrance that clashed sharply with the complex, expensive scents that floated through his home, like new leather and gourmet coffee. The locket was a dispute between realities. For Marta, that locket was more than a keepsake, it was her lifeline. While David weighed the object in his cocoon of comfort, Marta's mind, hundreds of miles from Greenwich, was processing the pain of being fired. She did not grieve the job, but the loss of the only solid bridge between her and the future she desperately wanted for the child in the photograph. The locket contained the image of her little Julian, who had been left in the care of an aunt in a smaller town so that Marta could pay for school and the dream of a future without the burden of invisibility. The image inside the locket was the catalyst that ignited her sense of purpose. With each exhausting commute, each stranger's child she comforted, each moment when she felt the weight of humiliation, she would squeeze the worn metal. It was silent proof that her invisibility was temporary, a necessary armor forged in iron and sacrificed to protect what was real and vulnerable. It was the mute scream of her dignity, which David, with his selective hearing, would never be able to perceive. David, in turn, had never needed a catalyst. His children, Olivia and Ethan, were a natural extension of his wealth. They had everything: the name, the comfort, the safety. Everything, except perhaps, the pure emotional connection that Marta's sacrifice represented. He saw his own children standing at the bedroom door, looking at him in quiet confusion. They felt the absence of the ghost he had exorcised. What they felt was not sadness, but disarray, the hollow left by the only person who gave them uninterrupted attention. Suddenly, Olivia's tantrum no longer felt like a problem, but like a symptom of something he could not buy: genuine attention. The time David bought for himself by delegating parenthood was the same time that Marta stole from her own life in order to survive. The weight of that moral equation began to press down on him. The locket was not just an object, it was the weight of the moral scale that David had knocked off balance with one gesture of contempt. That locket had no monetary value, it was a moment of truth. It confronted David with the harsh reality that the life of the woman he had despised was guided by a love and a dignity that his money could never corrupt or erase. It was a shared value, the universal connection of the struggle to give the best to one's children, which David was only now realizing he shared with the world he had always looked down on. The locket was the point of intersection, the portal to a vulnerability that David had avoided with his fortune, but that now called out to him. For the first time, David felt the sting of oxytocin, the birth of a bond and a moral responsibility. He could no longer dismiss Marta as a flaw in his system. The growing need to discover who Julian, the boy in the photograph, was, and what Marta's true story of sacrifice might be, became an urgency that replaced his business priorities. But what he did not know was that this simple connection would awaken something far more dangerous, a threat that had taken shape in the shadows of his own wealth and that would make the stability of his life look meaningless. The search for Marta's dignity was about to collide with one of David Thorne's own dark secrets. But the connection between David and Marta awakened the cruel vigilance of what he feared most: the collapse of his own image and the merciless judgment of his circle. The locket, That bond of oxytocin between him and Marta now became a magnet for stress and tension. His decision to look for the nanny, driven by a strange moral guilt, forced him to act outside the cold protocols of his corporate life, and in Greenwich, that was a fatal mistake. David began his search awkwardly. He used his network of contacts to track down the address Marta had written on her hiring form, a neighborhood he knew only as a place people passed through, never a destination. His insistence on resolving a personal matter of such low status aroused the malicious curiosity of his assistant, Mrs. Albright, the official guardian of the Thorne family's image. To David, the locket was a weight on his conscience. To Albright, it was a dangerous anomaly. Tension grew the moment David stepped beyond his bubble of safety. The drive to Marta's home, far from the gates of his mansion, was a plunge into a reality he had paid to forget. The dramatic contrast was painful: narrow streets, clustered houses, a palpable struggle for every square meter of dignity. His luxury car, a symbol of power in Greenwich, became there a lighthouse of arrogance, attracting looks of distrust and even hostility. Cortisol began to rise, replacing curiosity with paranoia. David was exposed. The first setback came from inside his own home. In trying to hide his investigation, David grew evasive with Albright, a failure of communication that she interpreted as a threat to order. Mrs. Albright, whose own social status depended on the immaculate perfection of the Thornes, sensed an opening. She started to dig into Marta and the reason for her dismissal, not in order to help, but to protect the family name, erasing any trace of scandal or unnecessary connection with the lower classes. The external obstacle was not a faraway enemy, but a watchful guard within his own walls, nourished by the same culture of contempt that he embodied. The threat was double: social exposure for David and real danger for Marta. When David finally located the address, he discovered that Marta had vanished. The apartment was empty. Julian's aunt, visibly stressed and defensive, revealed what David feared: without a stable job, Marta had lost her advance rent payment and had been forced to leave in a hurry. Marta's sacrifice was now in total jeopardy. Julian's dream was collapsing under the weight of her own invisibility. In her silent and ruthless investigation, Mrs. Albright discovered not only Marta's previous address, but also Julian's delicate medical condition, the boy in the photograph. She did not see this as a reason for empathy, but as a weakness to be exploited in order to guarantee Marta's permanent silence. If Marta ever caused disruption in David's life again, Albright would make the threat very real, exposing Julian's situation and interfering with the meager resources the boy depended on. Tension peaked. David now understood that his cold dismissal had triggered a crisis of dignity with devastating consequences. He was trapped in a web of his own making. His desire to repair the wrong and lighten his moral burden was now in conflict with adrenaline pumping through his veins as time slipped away, and with the cortisol of knowing that his own team might expose him. He had to find Marta, not only to return the locket, but to stop his own protection system from destroying the life of the woman he had rendered invisible. The challenge was clear: how could he overcome the threat of social humiliation and Marta's helplessness if he himself was the original source of the problem? Faced with looming humiliation and the newly discovered desperation of Marta, David had to choose between preserving his fortune and his image, or embracing dignity and justice. The news that Albright was digging, and the sight of Marta's empty apartment echoing the emptiness in the child's photograph, struck him with the force of a moral dilemma that money could never resolve. Time was running, and Albright's threat was real: protect the Thorne brand, even if that meant silencing and wounding Marta beyond repair. David's dilemma was visceral. On one side stood the comfort he had bought, decades of hard work and selfishness that had built his empire, his untouchable reputation, the forced respect of his social circle. To yield to this search for Marta meant exposing the vulnerability of his status. It meant giving Albright and his rivals a weapon to question his stability and, worse, his humanity. The cost was the serotonin that came from social status, the pride of being out of reach. On the other side was the emotional cost of making the wrong choice. The locket, still in his pocket, burned like an invisible ink stain. It represented the humiliation he had inflicted, the parental sacrifice he had dismissed. For the first time, he saw himself connected to Marta's universal pain, to the desperate fight for dignity. To ignore that now, after seeing Julian's photograph in the empty apartment, would no longer be a mistake, it would be a deliberate betrayal. The storm of cortisol gave way to an intense focus. David pulled his luxury car to a stop on an anonymous street. He could not use his usual network of contacts. They would give him away. He realized that in order to find Marta, he would have to act as she did, invisible, without resources, trusting a system different from money. The transformative decision was not a strategy, but a gesture. David took his high-security phone and, instead of calling his lawyer or Albright, he called a former assistant he had let go years earlier, a woman he had treated with respect and who had retired quietly. It was a shot in the dark. The choice was to trust a past human connection instead of his current power. He made a simple, direct request, explaining the situation of the locket and of Marta, and admitting that he had been wrong. The confession of vulnerability drained his serotonin for a moment, stripping away his pride, but it promised a different kind of reward, moral resolution. When he ended the call, David felt a strange lightness. He had renounced, for a brief instant, the dogma that governed his life, that only power mattered. He had chosen dignity over appearance. The sacrifice of his status was the price of redemption. Now he could only wait. But he knew Albright would not wait. The threat was already in motion. With every passing minute she advanced, and David's choice left him naked, unprotected by his own armor. His decision to help Marta placed him on a collision course with the most destructive force in his world, the fury of money that feels betrayed. One question hung in the silent air of the car: was the sacrifice of his life as he knew it worth rescuing someone else's dignity? And was he truly prepared for the final price of that choice? His choice cost him not only his peace, but the cold certainty that human dignity is always the first casualty in the war of money. David Thorne's gesture of trust, the decision to seek help outside his empire, was an act of vulnerability that his own system answered with silent violence. He had chosen humanity over status, and the world of Greenwich did not forgive such betrayal. The price began to be charged immediately. Within a few hours, Mrs. Albright, driven by her twisted loyalty to appearances and by the fear that David might look weak or entangled in drama, acted with surgical precision. She did not only confirm the suspicions of David's circle, that the dismissal of the nanny involved more than a child's crying. She also started to plant seeds of doubt about his emotional stability and his ability to judge. David was isolated. Important calls went unanswered. Crucial meetings were postponed. His power, which had seemed as solid as concrete, was in truth a fragile social construction dependent on an immaculate image. Isolation was the first punishment. David found himself sitting in the icy vastness of his mansion. Marta's locket on the glass table, feeling a loneliness he had never recognized before. Previously, solitude had felt like a luxury. Now it was ostracism. He was at the lowest point of his own power. His error had not been firing Marta, but caring about the consequences, exposing a remnant of conscience that his world considered unacceptable. He had inflicted upon himself the same social invisibility that Marta lived every day. But the most devastating blow fell on Marta. Unaware of David's gesture, she was in a state of total helplessness. The promise she had made to Julian, of a stable future, lay shattered. Fleeing overdue rent and without a steady job, she had taken refuge with her son in an even more distant suburb, where poverty was not only the lack of money, but the absence of hope. Cortisol in Marta was at its highest. Parental sacrifice had turned into a humiliating failure. She felt responsible for every difficulty Julian faced, feeling in her own skin the pain of social humiliation, the shame of not being able to protect her child in a world that only looks upward. The official notification came like a final blow. Mrs. Albright, having discovered where Marta was through discreet and unethical methods, filed an anonymous report with child welfare authorities, suggesting neglect because of Marta's instability and Julian's delicate condition. The goal was not to protect the child, but to guarantee the nanny's silence, threatening to remove Julian from her care. Marta's terror was palpable, the sacrifice of an entire life at risk of being erased by a piece of paper moved by the interests of the elite. David learned of Albright's move through his former assistant, who warned him of how serious the situation was. The information hit David like a bullet. His mistake had not only cost him his reputation, it had placed at risk the only thing that mattered to Marta, her son. The final price of David's choice was the crushing awareness of his complicity. He saw clearly, his indifference had armed Albright's hand. The culture of contempt that he had embraced was the true villain. He was at rock bottom, isolated, humiliated in his own domain and directly responsible for Marta's extreme suffering. The question, is there any way back? Echoed through the silent mansion, pure cortisol demanding a dramatic transformation. At the bottom, humiliated and alone, David discovered that true power was not in money, but in shared vulnerability. The threat hanging over Julian, the boy in the locket, was a boundary he could not cross. David understood that to save Marta and restore her dignity, he would have to dismantle the machine of contempt that he himself had built and financed. The new perspective did not come from Wall Street, but from an ordinary living room. She represented the humanity he had ignored. David met her in a modest cafe, far from Greenwich, and there he did the one thing he had not done in years. He admitted his weakness and his guilt. He did not ask her for a favor based on power, but appealed to her sense of justice. Noradrenaline, the focus and rush of the fight, began to flow through him, replacing the paralyzing anxiety of stress. Sarah, who knew the inner workings of the Thorn Company and Albright's cold ambition, agreed to help. She knew that Albright was driven by fear and by the need to protect David's image. The bold plan did not involve expensive lawyers or intimidation tactics. It relied on invisibility and time. The first step was to protect Marta. With her quiet network of contacts, Sarah tracked down Marta and Julian. The place was humble, but safe. Under Sarah's instructions, David prepared for the meeting. He could not arrive in his luxury car, that would be an even greater humiliation. Instead, he used a rented car and, most importantly, he brought the locket with him. When he finally met Marta, the scene had a raw, painful honesty. She was exhausted, but her dignity was intact as she protected Julian. There was no long speech, only the silent narration of what had happened. David did not offer empty apologies. He extended his hand, holding the locket, and gave back her most precious link. It was a gesture of recognition, a silent admission that her sacrifice had been seen at last. The decisive action was against Albright. David and Sarah's plan was to reverse Albright's report and expose the abuse of power, while preserving Marta's dignity. David knew that Albright had used company resources, emails, files, and confidential medical information about Julian, in order to file the anonymous report. The plan was simple and brilliant. David, still isolated and pretending to be fragile, would call an emergency meeting, not to attack Albright directly, but to reassert his power in an unexpected way. He knew that Albright's fear of losing her status would drive her to make a mistake under pressure. The goal was to make her rely on the information she had obtained illegally, and in doing so, expose herself. The game of invisibility had been reversed. Marta, once invisible and humiliated, was now at the center of an operation for justice. David, once invincible, now moved in the shadows of his own life, as an ally. The focus now was the reward of progress, the promise that justice was possible if he acted with moral courage instead of the brute force of money. Noradrenaline pulsed, turning panic into concentrated action. The millionaire was ready to risk everything he owned to restore what his money had tried to destroy. But how could David turn the game in his favor without being completely annihilated by the very culture of contempt he represented? The final revelation uncovered not only the price of dignity, but the legacy that is born when a heart of stone finally sees universal pain. David Thorne's boardroom, once a sanctuary of cold, impersonal power, became the stage for a moral reckoning. Mrs. Albright, confident in the impunity that came with her position as protector of the empire, attended the emergency meeting. Her posture radiated superiority, the certainty that hierarchy and fear would prevail over any emotion. David began the meeting not with rage or revenge, but with a dangerous quiet that was more disturbing than any outburst. He spoke of the importance of the company's vision, of trust, and finally, of the humanity that should underlie any lasting empire. While David spoke, Sarah, his discreet ally, worked in the background. Using the remote access she had kept, she projected onto the screen not financial spreadsheets, but a trace of Albright's communications. There, in plain view of the most important executives, was the proof, the emails, the phone logs, the detailed reports about Marta and Julian, the anonymous complaints filed with the sole purpose of destroying a life in order to protect an appearance. Albright tried to deny it, her voice breaking in a mixture of rage and terror. She argued that she had merely protected David's image and the company's interests, acting in line with the culture of contempt he himself had fostered for years. This was David's bitter awakening, the final blow to his former self. He was not only firing an employee, he was expelling the toxic culture that had nearly destroyed Marta and his own soul. Albright's dismissal was an act of cathartic justice, a release of tension for everyone in the room, awash in endorphins. The vicious cycle of elitist contempt had been broken at its source, proving that morality could, indeed, defeat power. With the internal threat removed, David focused entirely on Marta. Money, which had once been the root of his moral problems and the tool of his blindness, became, for the first time, a tool of redemption. He used his influence and resources not to silence, but to correct the harm that had been done. The child welfare report, based on Albright's lies, was withdrawn, and Marta's situation was clarified. More importantly, through Sarah and under strict anonymity, he secured the ongoing medical care Julian needed and created a modest, supervised trust fund for the boy's education. The purpose was not to pay the nanny, but to honor the parental sacrifice he had once dismissed so coldly. It was an indirect acknowledgement of Marta's undeniable dignity. Marta, in turn, experienced a deep emotional resolution. The threat of losing Julian dissolved like smoke, and the weight of her sacrifice finally eased. The locket, back around her neck, was no longer a symbol of forced suffering, but an emblem of resistance and silent victory. She had defeated David's system without ever having to shout, simply by holding onto her truth. The serotonin of triumph, the pride of having kept her dignity intact under maximum pressure, was now hers. She could finally focus on her son's healing and on building a future with recognition and peace, a future that her sacrifice had bought. David and Marta never met again. The story did not need a final scene of closeness. The bond of oxytocin between them had fulfilled its purpose, to restore humanity in one and dignity in the other. Marta's sacrifice had not been in vain, it had forced David to see. David's transformation was subtle, but absolute. He remained a millionaire, but wealth was no longer his armor, it was his responsibility. He dismantled the culture of fear in his company, promoted Sarah, and created a strong support fund for employees in difficult times, ensuring that parental sacrifice and the struggle for dignity would be seen, recognized, and actively supported. In his domain, invisibility would no longer be tolerated. David understood that true wealth did not lie in the absence of problems, but in the ability to face and repair pain. He became a man who lived with the burden of what he had done, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who, too late, had found a moral purpose. The vicious cycle of contempt was broken, replaced by an unbreakable bond of inspiration. The lesson was clear: the only appearance that truly matters is the one that belongs to the soul.